Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding, and you are once again listening to PreserveCast. I am so excited to introduce you to today's guest, but before we get there, I want to remind people that are listening to PreserveCast, if you've enjoyed this and you're one of the growing numbers who are enjoying this and streaming it, I would love for you to click like, to share it with your social networks if you've listened to an episode that you really enjoyed or this episode. And also make sure you rate and subscribe to the podcast on wherever you listen to this to. We're on all sorts of platforms. We would definitely appreciate that. Today, we're going to be talking about something that I've been fascinated about, and I love digging into something that I know not as much about as I do some things, and this is certainly one of those. We're going to be talking with Dr. Tim Altenhof, who is a senior scientist in the Department for Architectural Theory and History at the University of Innsbruck. And we're going to be talking all about a new book that he has published called Breathing Space, The Architecture of Pneumatic Beings. And I think this is such an interesting concept and such an interesting topic to dig into. But Tim, before we dig into the book and we talk a little bit about that, let us know a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up, and what would put you on the path to science and architecture?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Nick. That's a great occasion. I'm very delighted that you're interested and your audience might be interested in the conversation and the book. I grew up in the south of Germany, actually, so close to Lake Constance, which is a federal state called Baden-Württemberg, so it's somewhere between Bavaria and France, but literally right on the Swiss-German border. It's quite a fascinating place to grow up. I was actually born at the foot of a volcano. I mean, needless to say, extinct volcano, probably goes back some 7-8 million years. That's not really my topic, but it has a fascinating history, of course, because there is, I think it's the biggest ruin also in Germany, the biggest castle ruin that sits on top of that volcano. Was destroyed by the French around 1800 in the German-French War. But it's a wonderful piece of landscape, I shall say, because it's really right on Lake Constance. It's an undulating pre-alpine region. You have vistas of the Swiss Alps during good weather conditions. I spent most of my youth outside, outdoors. I think because of the proximity to that border also, there is a certain openness in the local residents and people there, lots of traffic going back and forth. I mean, the kind of porosity you usually get at border states, and the dialect is quite fascinating because it's somewhat related to Swiss German, but then very specific at the same time. So sometimes you would just cross a village and go to the next town and people understand each other, of course, but they are pretty idiosyncratic and distinct at the same time. But yeah, that's.
I've been smiling along. People are listening; they can't see that, but I don't. I mean, I hate to say it, but why would you ever leave? It sounds like a magical place. I mean, I think we can all envision this in our head. I mean, this is like one of the most gorgeous regions in the world, right? I mean, it is a stunning place, and also a lot of fresh air. Right, like it just sounds fresh. It just the Alps, and it just sounds fresh. So, growing up the way that you did and where you did, what did you decide you were going to go off to study?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been pondering that often enough. I mean, in particular, my mother and I, because it traces back quite some time, and I don't have the recollection she has, but apparently, I mean, the story goes that at some point in high school, I was probably around 14 or 15, there was a mandatory internship that one had to carry out for a week. You could essentially choose whatever you want. And apparently, it caused quite some confusion among my fellow classmates, because they were having a hard time finding out what they should do. And apparently I must have been so determined that with a blink of an eye I said, I'm going to spend a week in an architecture office at the age of 15, did my internship there without hesitation. So I have no explanation why I was so determined, but I knew that apparently from early on. I mean, it's not the beautiful story you read about famous architects else, where they grow up, seeing the skyline of Manhattan, and then that inspires them to become architects. I somewhat had that deep inside me, and then it just came out. And I think I never let go of this idea. I mean, then 6-7 years later, I enrolled at a university in Germany, at the Bauhaus University, and studied architecture, and did that for 7 years.
And I mean, between the mandatory internship and studying architecture, were you inspired by the local architecture of southern Germany? Was historic architecture of interest in sort of like historic building patterns, or were you more, you talk about you went to Berlin, were you more interested in a more modern architecture? Like what kind of inspiration were you drawing during that period? Because I think that the reason I ask is I'm genuinely curious, but I'm also curious about when we get into this conversation about breath and air and how buildings breathe and how people breathe in buildings, how that has impacted your understanding and your awareness of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was probably less historic or traditional architecture. I'm not so sure there is much of that in that particular region. Something I've been mourning also for some time, because you would easily find that if you cross the border to Western Austria or even say northern Switzerland, I think there the idioms that you find in the language there also, they resonate much more strongly with local vernacular architecture, whereas in this particular part of Germany I've always felt it's a bit of a mess. So there is not much of a particular tradition. So something I would rather critique than admire. So I think in many ways it was probably more contemporary, if not radical, or even avant-garde architecture. So if you travel, an hour and a half by train, you reach the Vitra Design Museum, which is close to the French-Swiss border, close to Basel, and there you find Zaha Hadid's first commission in Germany, her famous fire station on the company's grounds. And I think that kind of work, which I saw probably at the age of 19, 20-ish for the first time, I think that reignited my desire to study architecture, much more so than any vernacular or historic architecture in the region.
That's fascinating, and I'm glad I asked the question, because I, of course, in my head I was imagining something quite different about where you grew up. But it's interesting that it didn't have that level of vernacular architecture that might spring to your mind when you think of that part of Germany. So, what was your first job in the field after that? Did you become a practicing architect? Were you working in a firm, or did you stay in academia?
No, actually, I did work in a firm. I think I was pretty exhausted by the time I graduated. I mean, I spent several years at Viennese art schools. There were two different ones. I attended both, and it was more or less, for European conditions, I would say somewhat elitist. I mean, you had to pass an entry exam and workshop for several days. You had to produce a portfolio that they then evaluated. So not many people were actually admitted to the school, and pressure was high, and the requirements, the workload was pretty high. So in many ways, I think I felt somewhat exhausted by the time I graduated. And then a first job was offered through my thesis advisor. She had a friend in Basel, essentially, and a small project. And I thought this was just a perfect condition for me, not too far from home, a somewhat small project. And then it didn't really work out the way I envisioned it. After 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe a month, I dropped the gun and then went back to Vienna and picked up freelance work there. So it wasn't really in any way strategic, as it was. I didn't pick. I wasn't really passionate for working for one particular firm because I thought this was the most valuable and strategic decision. And if I just did that for 2 or 3 years, this would inevitably lead to the next step. And there wasn't any plan like that. So essentially, I was freelancing. And what often happens, and what many people mourn, of course, after graduation, is that you do all this academic exploration, you design, you do research, and then essentially you may want to build also, but then you end up in firms and you practice, and then you get stuck with design work. So you hardly ever get to the point of actually building something, because there is so little projects that get built, and then so many people don't actually have the experience to undertake any such project. So you often work in the early design schemes, which is fun for some time, and if you appreciate that, of course, for others forever. But at one point, you just want to do something hands-on, and I think I just did that for long enough, for 2 or 3 years, design work and competitions, some of which ended somewhere and won prizes, and others just ended nowhere. And then at one point, I appreciated much of the experience, but I also sensed a certain dearth of discussion. There was a certain lacuna, because you just do design work and design work and design work, and it's exciting, but you want to carry on with what you've had and experienced at the university. And I think rather than trying to implement that in the profession, I just realized that I want to be back at university and getting back into these discussions and dig deeper and have arguments and exchange ideas and have the time and the luxury also to exchange ideas. And that finally got me to drop practice and apply for a PhD program, and it worked out. And then I ended up at Yale.
So the book that we're talking about today is one that I think is fascinating. I told Tim before we pressed record, I had the chance to go overseas recently to Berlin, and was fascinated, just taken by and impressed by this idea of Luft and opening up your space and sort of letting the fresh air come in, which seems sort of obvious when you do it. It's not the most groundbreaking thing, but it really is valuable. And so often we don't do it. We trap our spaces. The book is called Breathing Space, The Architecture of Pneumatic Beings. Tell me a little bit about how you got to writing this book. What was the inspiration? Was there sort of a certain moment that you can point back to and you can say, that was when I decided I really wanted to dig into this topic?
So I think a little, I can try to pinpoint it, because I think it's partly owing to the nature of the PhD program also in US academia, because that doesn't pertain to Yale exclusively, because what often happens is that you have mandatory classwork. So there is 2 years preceding the actual PhD of coursework, which at major universities, of course, invites all kinds of investigations, because essentially you can take seminars everywhere, in complete departments, in language departments, in art history and philosophy, and have an incredible exposure to a plethora of ideas and different methods and approaches. And I think just having the luxury of doing that and then coming back to architecture just changed my perspective on the field tremendously after these 2 or 3 years of practice. And then I began to look really carefully into modernist architecture, and some authors also in particular that have been writing in the 1920s, European authors, somewhat there was a transitional period, say from art history to architecture criticism, which didn't really exist before that. So some of the early writers of architectural history, they were usually trained art historians. And I began to look really carefully into some of these writings, in particular by a Swiss guy called Siegfried Gideon. He later taught at Harvard in the late 1930s. And that was quite interesting. And he was one of the major proponents of modernist architecture in Europe, and found his own prose. It's not very scholarly oftentimes. It's almost poetic, and it's what others later described operative criticism. So he really advocated for modern architecture, and he found a language that was quite fascinating for me because he often used words like interpenetration. So I think that had much to do with certain ideas of transparency, the massive deployment of glass in the architecture of the 1920s. And his idea to describe that, to come to terms with that, was using concepts like interpenetration. So essentially what he wanted to say is that inside and outside boundaries no longer exist. They begin to collapse. Inside and outside begins to blend into each other. There is no clear demarcation between an interior and an exterior of the building. And I think the primary idea, because he wrote this, was, of course, as I said, the huge deployment of glass. But at the same time, I found too many allusions, very conspicuously, too many allusions to air in motion, to airflow, and also to the very idea of breathing. So at one point, I began to think about this corporeal understanding that was often, say, transposed onto an understanding of the building. So what I want to say is that oftentimes critics and architectural historians, in the ways in which they think about, conceive of buildings, they have corporeal ideas. So there is an understanding of the body that is then being inscribed almost in the building. And I think that often happens. German language has a particular term that is really often used, not so common in English, which is the so-called Baukörper. So it's literally the building body, if you translate it. And of course, that carries all these notions of the physical body into the buildings. And there are many, many metaphors, of course, in architectural discourse. When people speak of circulation, for instance, nowadays has to do with access routes, so escalators, elevators, lobby spaces, corridors. But essentially those spaces that are used for the motion or the movement of human beings, but also of goods, of all kinds of things. And that's a bodily analogy, because circulation really has to do with blood flow. And oftentimes we have corporeal images that we begin to dump onto architecture. And I think breathing, I found so fascinating, because that's precisely what the lungs for me do. They collapse this very distinction between inside and outside, right? It's clearly an organ that is buried in our thoracic cage. There is absolutely no doubt about that. But the minute we are born, we plug ourselves into the atmosphere, and we stay connected for as long as we live. So the lung causes this topological problem, because it's an internal organ, but it stays connected to the outside world constantly. Every second you inhale and you exhale air from the natural world. And if you stop doing that, you can no longer live. And I find that very, very fascinating. And just becoming aware of that issue, I began to dig deeper into some of these discussions around that time. And there were so many allusions to breathing, and that I at one point began to trace what I call this breathing culture. I think there was a massive awareness, a cultural awareness, to these respiratory things around 1900, and people were highly aware of that. And I think what is important maybe to contextualize that is, of course, that this work, I mean, the book is now substantially revised. In many ways, it's a new project, but it's, of course, heavily informed by the dissertation, has the same title, but at the same time, it caters to a broader audience, to a more general readership. So it's no longer a PhD, but this work, traces back to some 10 years now. I think I really essentially started to work on the PhD in 2015. So I think historic context really matters, because it's clearly pre-COVID-19. And around that time, I think part of the argument, and it still holds true today, is, of course, that breathing is a background activity. We don't talk about this, okay? We just perform it. But it's very interesting, because breathing as a physiological process is part of the autonomic nervous system. We don't really control this actively, because it's a vital function. It's absolutely quintessential for living beings. And if we stop it, we can't even do that voluntarily. We can, you can try to stop breathing. You might do that for a minute, but then you gasp for breath. So essentially, one can claim that breathing happens in the background, unless it comes under duress, unless something really happens and you are threatened, and then you become aware of it. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has fundamentally altered that condition, because for almost 2 or 3 years, we've been obsessively concerned with all things respiratory, and the media, discussed on a daily basis case numbers, and we had all the incidents, and family relatives reported. So everyone was talking about breathing for 2 or 3 years. So the premise of this work, the way I set it up in 2015, was really fundamentally altered with the COVID-19 pandemic. So
I guess it was,
changed?
but in some ways, I mean, I think that's still a fair assessment, and I particularly when it comes to architecture, I think there's so much that happens with our buildings when it comes to breath and breathing and air that we either take for granted or we don't really take into account, in that buildings. And I was just on another interview talking about something completely different. And I was talking about, if you're in a commercial building right now, can you open the window? We were talking about sustainability, but, I don't think I've ever worked in a commercial office building myself personally where I could open the window, which is a really weird statement to make because it seems like something you would want. And it seems something so utterly unsustainable to not be able to bring some fresh air in. So, I mean, I guess maybe one of the questions I was going to ask, because I still do think that the premise holds, even though we know maybe perhaps a little bit more about how germs are spread. And if you're in a theater with a bunch of people who have COVID, you're probably going to get it. But I know the book explores this a little bit. How has our understanding of breath and air in buildings changed over time? I mean, I know you're looking at this one period, but is what's old new again in a sense? I mean, are we back to at least moving in the right direction about that sense of breath and breathing and air and the need for fresh air in buildings? Because it seems like we went through a period where the goal was to seal ourselves off from everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in many ways it still holds true. I think there might be an undercurrent, something of a counter movement now in more avant-garde oriented practices that deal with sustainability, because there is a certain recourse to primitive ideas, not in a condescending way, quite to the contrary. So I think passive ventilation techniques, they come back to play, and much of that has a history that traces several hundreds, if not thousands of years, passive cooling approaches in architecture. So I think coming back to that idea, and the one that you observed, I think, which many of us share, is that in many of these buildings, probably not the residential buildings we find ourselves in currently, but in many of these corporate spaces, as you rightly point out, you're completely sealed, and there is absolutely no way for you to engage the surroundings and the natural world. And I think this condition is just only being exacerbated. I mean, unless there are particular practices that set out to countervail that, and to find projects and approaches that tap more into these older ideas, which are usually passive, trying to save energy and actually be more sustainable. I think we have a gradual seclusion from the atmosphere. I think that's what these buildings essentially do, and I think that's also how I experienced my time in the Yale School of Architecture building, because there's also one that had been refurbished and restored at one point, was destroyed by a fire, and then it fell into despair, and then finally it got restored again. But now you find yourself in an architecture school, one of the most amazing architecture school buildings in the world, probably, but you cannot open a single window. That's exactly how you describe it, and that kind of experience, which is a collective experience that many of us share, I think it speaks volumes to the way and that's, I think, the idea and the hope of this book, also to bring this problem, this issue to bear, to just raise this as a question. I mean, is this our idea of living on this planet, by just increasingly secluding us and sequestering us from the broader atmosphere, right? Do we want to live in these sealed containers and not take care of the environment any longer? Because I think that speaks volumes to that. I mean, why would you seal yourself off from, I don't know, planetary conditions unless you care about those, and unless they are really beneficial and pleasant? I think it's baffling.
Well, I think, and then, that kind of brings us back to the book. I wanted to give people a sense, and we'll put a link in the show notes so people can pick up the book. I mean, obviously, we only have a short amount of time with Tim today, so we won't be able to talk about every last aspect of the book. We want to kind of give you a taste. But it's interesting that you let off sort of talking about this initial writer that you were reading, who's sort of poetic, which I have to say you've picked up a little bit on. I love listening to you talk about this because you're very passionate about it. But you're talking about how he's writing at a time about modern architecture and sort of glass and sort of this idea that there is no boundary between the two. But I think for so many of us, we think of modern architecture and modernism as this moment when we begin to seal ourselves off. Where is the disconnect there? And is that part of the story that you tell, in that, like, was there a hope? Was there a desire for something that just didn't end up materializing the way that those initial visionaries had hoped?
Well, I think in many ways there might be parallel, as is as often the case in history and in certain accounts of periods and say our desire to periodicize certain movements. I think there are many parallel accounts of what modern architecture really is and when it began and how you can characterize it, what are its qualities. You can do that in formal terms and material terms. I think it's so codified and so much discussed also in terms of the avant-gardes and in terms of new production technologies and serial production, new materials, reinforced concrete, and so on and so forth. And I think one way of describing it is, of course, that it might have created the onset of this gradual seclusion from the environment, because essentially air conditioning began to take shape in the early 20th century. I mean, it was around 1900, and then I think probably first patented. I mean, I don't have the numbers all already at hand, but I think it was patented then around 1905 and 1906 for the first time, and then was constantly increasingly refined, of course, and that led essentially in the post World War II era to sealed containers. I think it was really first window-based operating boxes, but then essentially they got that inflected the entire building envelope. And the idea that you want to control the interior environment, I think that's pretty much what it is. It's an understanding of architecture, I would say, as a technology to alter the atmosphere. I think that's how we can conceive of architecture, whether modern or not, but that is what architecture does. And I think there is many, say, natural paths, also natural healers of that era, late 19th century. I don't want to dwell on that too much, but the interesting idea is that they share these sentiments, because they already argued that this is what our clothing does. So we put ourselves in attire, and we are no longer exposed in the nude to the atmosphere, which would be a natural circumstances. I mean, the most natural conditions. So in as much as our clothes begin to seal us off from the atmosphere, so does architecture. And I think that is one account of describing it. And I think I'm trying to create this counter narrative where, in fact, beginning in the mid-19th century, there was this increased awareness for breathing, which also had to do with the once again, emergence of tuberculosis. I mean, it wasn't a new disease, but conditions it began to spread again had to do with the industrialization, of course, more people living in denser cities and so on and so forth. So I think that's my reading of modernist architecture. So it's precisely not about sealing us off from the environment, but it's a certain understanding of buildings that are part of the broader atmosphere. And I think everything that happened afterwards is then from 1900 onwards until the present.
So I think it's interesting that you point out that you get into this in the book, sort of this the historical basis for this, and then where early modern thought was on it, how air conditioning impacts this. Give people a sense for where you take the book, and what are you hopeful about the future? Obviously, we want to encourage people to to pick it up, to read it, because there's so much to kind of digest in there. And obviously, as I said before, you're passionate about it, and you have a great mastery of understanding about this, and which is so fascinating to me too, because it's something, like you say, you just don't even think about sometimes. And I love those sorts of stories and those topics to make us think about the world all around us. But from structures that are inflated themselves by air to the future and this more sustainable approach, are you hopeful, and what are you hopeful for?
I think I would be hopeful if there would be more, say, an initial reflection or more broad-based awareness about the consequences of certain things that we undertake. I mean, there is, many scholars working on air conditioning, which is not really my primary subject or field, but I think oftentimes we implement technology to ameliorate certain conditions, and we completely forget that this very technology that we begin to implement causes new problems or exacerbates a situation or a condition. And I think air conditioning might be one of them, because there is a vicious cycle. I mean, you for the better or worse, we all want to have comfort in our lives. Our bodies ask for comfort, and we want that for our friends and families. And I get the very idea, but then we implement air conditioning to adapt to the effects of climate change. And of course, by using this extra energy in order to install that, we just exacerbate the condition of climate change. So, and at the same time, I think sequestering us off from everyone else it's so fundamentally ethical and political at the same time, because it just means that people who have certain privileges will be able to live in certain buildings that have certain features that other people don't have access to. And it has to do with issues of health, of course. It has to do with all kinds of privileges. And I think just reflecting upon these issues, and luften also, as you say, I mean, the very idea of letting fresh air in is such a convoluted issue, because what does that mean if I let fresh air into the house around Lake Constance or in New York City? Because we have so many local differences in air qualities. And of course, doing that in Beijing or in Manhattan is not the same as doing it somewhere in the Swiss Alps. So I think the very idea of taking fresh air has to be fundamentally debated or negotiated. So maybe in a city like Manhattan, you don't even want to have fresh air in your building because it's everything but fresh air. So maybe you want to fight all the pollutants and keep them at bay and don't let them seep into your building. But then who gets to do that? I mean, it's usually people who have more privileges and who have better building equipment and better technologies, but it always comes at the expense of everyone else because it exhausts energy. And I think we have to become aware of that.
Yeah, I think what you're asking for, and we had another guest on, Erica Avrami, who is an architectural historian and historian of preservation, and she talks about second order preservation. She published a book called that. People can go back, listen to that episode, and this whole idea of second order economics, and where you think not just about what your decision is causing, but what decisions it causes down the road and what other impacts it has. And that you're so right about that with air and buildings, and you could also be describing health, right? Where it's like you take one pill, but then that pill solves one problem, but it causes a new problem. So then you take another pill to solve the problem and it just cascades. It also makes me think, even with air and structures, it always strikes me as interesting as a historic preservationist and dealing in historic buildings that are kind of designed to at least breathe in different ways, maybe not just with windows, but to allow circulation of air. That in modern construction, you actually have, and you probably know the correct term for these things, but air exchangers that are bringing fresh air into modern residential because they're so hermetically sealed that you have to have that. And that always blows my mind, because I'm like, we have become so good at sealing a building from an energy efficiency standpoint that we actually have to have a machine that brings air inside of it. Yeah. And that to me is like perfect. It's a perfect sort of microcosm of the situation that we're dealing with, and why books like yours are so important to kind of illuminate this question, give us the background on it, and then let us think about where we want to take architecture and our built environment as we move forward.
Right. And if it wouldn't be so so sad. It would be hilarious, and we would just burst into laughter. And I have this one anecdote also in the book that it essentially corroborates what you just mentioned, because it's really an anecdote, and there was a publication in a German newspaper in 2016, actually in Berlin, a daily newspaper like the New York Times. And there was an article called When Buildings Have Difficulty Breathing, and essentially addressed what you just mentioned. So there was a bunch of northern German schools by the time, and they had been insulated with hyper efficient thermal insulation, all in the name of energy efficiency, of course, because you want to be sustainable and environmentally friendly. So for good cause, you save the energy that the building actually takes. And then these buildings ended up being so hermetically sealed that students actually inside the classrooms had not enough access to air, to fresh air. And then the carbon dioxide levels rose so drastically. And the breaks between classes were so short that they couldn't ventilate the interior spaces properly enough. So that caused tremendous health issues. And some students almost fainted. And because the buildings already had been insulated so well, they then had to install ventilation systems to provide fresh air. So essentially, you take all these measures to save energy to implement another technology to ameliorate the causes that your first measures provoked. I mean, it's absurd. It's a vicious cycle. And it's really hilarious, but it's so sad at the same time, because I think we are just stifled by all these regulations. We just think that saving energy is always the fantastic cause. There are no doubts about that. But I think at one point we should use our brains also and begin to wonder at what costs we undertake certain measures. And maybe we shouldn't always overdo it, because it just brings about new problems. And what are we going to save then in the end? I mean,
yeah. I mean, the book Abundance by Ezra Klein has come up several times in the past here on PreserveCast in thinking about the regulations and the regulatory environment we create and what that means for architecture and preservation. And there's a perfect example where we got so good at being sustainable that we made our students pass out. And that's not really the end goal for anybody. And I think, as you say, it's sort of comical, but it really points back to a book like this is just really valuable at this moment for architecture students, for preservationists thinking about how you use the existing historic structure, to teach about what works, what doesn't work, but just to think about breath and that space, and to take a deep breath and think about all of this is terribly important. And we've got a great book produced and published and authored by Tim Altenhof. And we've been talking about it all today here on PreserveCast. The book, again, is called Breathing Space, The Architecture of Pneumatic Beings. And we have a link in the show notes. Encourage you to pick it up. It's a fascinating read, particularly, as I said, about something, and Tim said this as well, something that we do that we don't even think about, but that is critically important. And our buildings have a big impact on the way that all happens. Tim, it's been such a pleasure to have you, to hear from you, to think about all of this. Before we go, we always ask people if they have a favorite historic place or site, some place that they could go back to time and time again.
Okay, that's a great question. I mean, I set out with this, castle in ruins where I was born. I wouldn't name that. I think it's really Tempelhof Field in Berlin, for various reasons, because I think it's a magnetic site for me, and it's, I think, the largest. I mean, I'm not so intrigued by these superlatives, but I think it's the largest inner city open space in the world now. It's probably, it's well over 300 hectares, but it's such an convoluted history. Of course, it's a former farmland, and it has been used for centuries as a parade ground for the Prussian army at first, and the Berlin garrison practiced there for many years. And then from the 1920s onwards, it's been transformed into an airport. Of course, has some Nazi legacy also in the 1930s, because they undertook enormous reconstructions there and expanded it, and it gained more importance, as you know, by the Allied airlift then in 48, 49, when Allied supplied aircraft landed in West Berlin. in the Berlin blockade, and I think it's so laced and layered with history. And then finally they stopped operation as an airport, I think, in 2008, and after some public debate, of course, because what does one do all of a sudden? You have this enormous urban area. I mean, it holds so much value for all kinds of real estate developers, and of course everyone has a certain idea and expectation, but they managed to secure it as a recreational park, which is really what it is since 2010. So people just flock there. You fly kites, you bike, you run on the former runways. Everything is transformed now. There are meadows, there is parkland, you can barbecue in allocated areas, there are dog areas. I mean, you can do whatever you want, essentially. So there is nothing, and at the same time, it allows you for almost everything. And it's I think it's one of the most historically convoluted sites. And the abandoned airport building, of course, is still there. The tower is still there. But I think that's one of the sites I like the most, just walking on these former runways for hours.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that these sites that are layered in history, I think, make them so fascinating because there's so many different aspects to kind of take in. And I think also, Tim, we found your next book, so we'll be looking for a history of Altenhof. Dr. Altenhof's history of Tempelhof Field would be fantastic. So
right.
We'll have you back when that one comes out.
Looking forward.
This has been a pleasure. We'll have the link in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining us today. We'll hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.